So you've probably seen the alarms lately about AI, specifically ChatGPT, and what it's supposedly doing to our brains. Headlines have been, well, screaming about AI's impact on our minds. Lots of buzzwords flying around like cognitive debt, concerns about our brains, collapsing under the weight of shortcuts, things like that. Even claims about the death of writing itself. Pretty strong warnings we've been seeing. And a lot of this was kicked off by that first brain scan study of ChatGPT users from MIT.
That's right. This study, Casamina et al., 2025, the title says it all, really. Your brain on ChatGPT, accumulation of cognitive debt when using an AI assistant for essay writing task. And it even came with this really striking graphic you probably saw.
Oh, yeah, the brain map one.
Exactly. Using EEG alpha band and dynamic direct transfer function analysis DDTF, they call it to show pretty clearly these differences in brain activity. Comparing people using an LLM versus a search engine versus just using their own brain. And the study's main finding, it certainly seemed to point toward this idea of AI-induced cognitive debt, a real warning sign.
Definitely felt like a warning. But, while those headlines paint let's say, a pretty dire picture, I can't help but feel there's something a bit too simplistic, almost too neat about that whole narrative. From your perspective, what is it that feels too tidy?
Well, it feels like the whole problem is being located very conveniently, safely inside the individual, as if the whole issue is just a personal failing, rather than maybe something bigger, something systemic. So I think our mission for this deep dive really is to unpack what that MIT brain study actually measured, what crucial context it might have, missed, and maybe get at the real story behind why people are actually turning to AI.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because the initial framing, the sort of viral panic, it often painted AI users as, lazy writers, didn't it? Weak-willed, dependent, incapable of that sort of noble struggle that real writing supposedly demands.
Yeah.
It really had this feel like a puritanical drumbeat of productivity culture.
Absolutely, where suffering is somehow a virtue and ease is basically a sin.
Exactly.
It really did feel like that. And when you dig into it a bit, you find there are really these three moral frames that seem to drive the public conversation around these alarms. The first one is what the source calls the hymn to discipline.
Okay.
This is the idea that, hard work is virtue, ease is decay, and that writing must hurt to be real. So in this frame, AI help isn't just a tool, it's framed as a vice, something for the weak-willed.
Okay, so you've laid out this hymn to discipline pretty clearly. It makes me think, though, about the practical examples, the ones that maybe show the hypocrisy in that thinking. What does the source material say about how that plays out?
Well, it points out that, a lot of the voices preaching this sermon, they happily outsourced their own writing back in the day. Think about retired executives who, quote, outsourced their own writing freely to secretaries, to typists.
Right, Prish.
Or, senior attorneys who now denounce the moral decay of AI but seem to forget the decades spent signing their names to briefs crafted entirely by junior associates. So it starts to look like the real offense isn't actually offloading the work itself. It's about who suddenly gets access to do it.
Ah, that's a really key point. And that idea of who gets to offload work, that often seems to tie into the second moral frame that we see driving this narrative, right? The generational refrain.
That's right. Yeah, this is that classic decline narrative, the idea that each new generation, the young people, they cannot write, cannot think, cannot function.
The kids these days argument.
Exactly. It's as if our brains' amazing ability to adapt, to change neuroplasticity is somehow being misunderstood, misread as this irreversible loss. Like any shift in how we do things is automatically a fall from grace.
Yeah, and it's kind of ironic, isn't it? You sometimes see these laments about declining writing skills popping up on social media, maybe in posts that are themselves riddled with broken grammar, often from people who never really made their living by words in the first place. You just think, hold on a second.
Precisely. And then there's the third frame, the self-reliance myth.
Okay.
So this is that sort of comforting story we tell ourselves, that all failure is personal. So if you find yourself dependent on AI, well, it's because you chose poorly, or maybe you lacked grit, You just took the easy road.
So this self-reliance myth, it suggests personal failings are the only reason for AI dependence. But, surely that perspective requires ignoring a whole lot of the actual pressures people are facing. What are some of those real-world conditions this myth tends to gloss over?
Oh, absolutely. It definitely requires a kind of careful blindness to the actual conditions driving AI use.
Yeah.
We're talking about things like workload that expands without limit,
Yeah.
deadlines that just keep shrinking, jobs that multiply in complexity while resources get thinner and thinner, and frankly, just quiet burnout, a lot of it. It's really important to see that AI use isn't always laziness. Often it's driven by genuine need, maybe disability, executive dysfunction challenges, language barriers, chronic exhaustion, or even neurodivergent processing needs. But in that self-reliance frame, none of that matters.
Which, yeah, brings us right back to the MIT study.
Yeah.
Because given all these real-world pressures you're listing, the really glaring omission is that it remains silent on the question that hovers largest. Why?
Right.
The participants' actual circumstances, their lives, they remain entirely unexamined.
Exactly. The list of reasons for cognitive offloading that the study just ignores, if you're willing to look, they're pretty extensive. Things like time scarcity.
Right.
Job insecurity. Big one.
Huge.
Educational trauma, executive functioning challenges, those language barriers we mentioned, neurodivergent processing needs, and that ever-present corporate productivity pressure. More, faster, cheaper now.
So, I mean, under those kinds of conditions, this cognitive offloading thing, it isn't some kind of moral failure. It sounds much more like adaptation. It's like a system quietly redesigning itself in response to unbearable load. And yet this adaptation, this shift, it gets scoffed at, kind of like how people used to grumble about, abandoning handwritten letters for typewritten notes.
Right. Ignoring the benefits.
Totally ignoring how efficiency and accessibility can actually be virtues. When you look at it like that, AI is just maybe the latest tool in a long line, like the typewriter or the word processor or even spell check.
That's such a crucial point. The study, it never asks why. And maybe, just maybe, asking why would mean admitting that the real cognitive debt isn't actually owed by the users at all. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the rise of AI-fueled labor substitution, it really follows a pattern far older than any neural connectivity map can capture.
Yeah, and we saw this play out really clearly with that whole overemployment phenomenon, didn't we?
Yeah.
Where workers were like juggling multiple full-time jobs and explicitly using AI just to survive because of rising costs of living and stagnant wages. It wasn't laziness. It was literally a lifeboat.
The lifeboat, exactly, stretching finite energy across infinite expectation.
Wow.
And this point, it really does highlight the connection to these larger economic forces. I mean, Marx would probably remind us, capitalism is driven always to extract more surplus value from labor.
Right.
The language model just became the next tool made available for that extraction. And interestingly, it was first seized by the workers themselves before capital reasserted its claim.
So if capital inevitably reclaims these tools, what was the immediate, real-world consequence for those workers who were already using AI out of sheer necessity?
Well, then came the, predictable backlash against overemployment. Companies firing people they discovered doing this, new policies popping up, increased surveillance. The thing is, the bosses weren't really scandalized by the outsourcing of cognition per se. What scandalized them was the wrong people doing the offloading without permission.
That's a really stark distinction. It makes it sound like the true project of these AI companies is actually to sever labor from production, to, reduce or eliminate entirely the costly, troublesome organizing body that is the worker. So the staggering amount of capital being poured into AI isn't just about making things efficient. It sounds like an investment for the permanent enclosure of cognitive labor under corporate control.
And we can't forget the unspoken environmental cost of all this AI either. There's the huge amount of water required to cool the processors.
There's a massive amount.
The electricity pulled from already stretched municipal systems, the heat expelled, not to mention the toxic waste generated. It's a pretty significant hidden burden.
Exactly. There's that example of the NAACP preparing to sue Elon Musk's XAI down in Memphis, right?
Yeah.
Over air pollution and resource extraction. It really frames it as a kind of resource colonialism reborn in data form.
Yeah.
It becomes pretty critical then to understand that the term assistive AI is often, misdirection.
Precisely. It's generally not about assisting the worker. It's more about controlling the conditions under which labor occurs, about who profits from its reduction.
So, okay. Pulling this all together then, the MIT study, it observes individuals offloading cognitive load, sure, but it just refuses to look up, to widen its gaze to the whole machine of accumulation that's driving these choices in the first place. And the neural data in that context, it almost becomes like scientific theater.
Yeah.
reducing this big social issue, maybe even social violence, down to private pathology.
Yeah.
So in the end, the questions that studies like MIT's are asking, they just feel simply too small for the moment we inhabit. It was never really just about whether people are getting dumber.
Which raises these really important questions, right? The better questions that maybe we should be asking are things like, why have we built systems that actually force people to offload cognitive labor just to survive?
Yeah.
And also, what happens when an economic system demands more than human cognition, more than any healthy nervous system can possibly sustain?
The neural scans, they only tell us that people adapt, and of course they do. But this adaptation, when it happens under duress like this, it feels more like coercion, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Not really a free choice. It's shaped by structures beyond individual control.
Exactly. So the real debt here, it's not cognitive, it's systemic. It's really the debt extracted from every worker forced to sprint just to remain in place while the treadmill beneath them just keeps accelerating.
And maybe, I can't help but wonder, is it possible that this kind of deeper questioning, this inquiry into power, into capital, into class, is that what now so alarms certain factions of the state? Are these sort of muttering campaigns against the scourge of communism or the calls to ban structural critiques? Are they maybe just an allergy to any lens that might reveal the mechanics of their own rule?
It's a powerful question. And we need to ask the larger questions, not because they're comfortable, but simply for accuracy. We really shouldn't shame those who reach for tools just to survive.
Yeah.
We should probably indict the system that made those tools necessary in the first place.